Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're going to tackle a huge topic. How do we find answers we can actually trust? It all comes down to something called research design. I mean, think about it. We're constantly bombarded with information, right? All these claims, these so-called studies. So how do you cut through all that noise and get to what's real? Well, it turns out it's not just about asking a question. It's all about how you go about finding the answer. Yeah, because if you just dive in headfirst with no real plan, you're basically just stumbling around in the dark. You could end up wasting all your time, or even worse, you might convince yourself of something that's just completely wrong. And that right there is the first big riddle we have to solve. Before you can even think about finding an answer, you have to figure out how you're even going to look for it in the first place. So, what's the solution to this riddle? It's something called a research design. And this quote from Kurlinger really nails it. The plan, structure, and strategy. See, it's not just a to-do list, it's the entire game plan, the how and the why behind your investigation. Okay, let's talk about your blueprint for discovery. And honestly, the best way to think about this is like an architect's blueprint for a house. You would never, ever start building a house without one, right? And it's the exact same idea when you're trying to build knowledge. This blueprint, it's your structural framework. It's what guides you step by step through the whole journey. It makes sure that everything, from the very first question you ask all the way to your final conclusion, is systematic, organized, and, well, built on solid ground. So, if we're sticking with this blueprint analogy, you've got to ask, what are the actual building blocks? What are the bricks and mortar of our research house? Well, this is where we get into understanding your variables. These are the absolute core of any study. They're the things we measure, the things we tweak, and the things we control. They are, quite literally, the essential building blocks for our blueprint. So what exactly is a variable? Well, pretty simple. It's just a concept that can have different values. Things like your weight, your height, your income, anything that can be measured and can change. Okay, but here's where it gets really interesting. It's not just about the variables themselves, but how they relate to each other. Usually, we're looking for a cause and effect relationship. We call the cause the independent variable, and the effect is the dependent variable. The whole idea is to see if changing the cause changes the effect. Let's make this super clear with an example. If we say that height depends on age, well, height is our dependent variable, and age is the independent one. It makes sense, right? As you get older, your height changes, but getting taller doesn't make you change your age. Age is the cause, height is the effect. All right, so we've got our building blocks down, we understand variables, so now let's look at a few of the key blueprints you can actually use. Now, big picture, research designs usually fall into two main camps. On one side, you have quantitative research. This is all about the numbers, graphs, and statistical analysis. It's for testing a specific hypothesis. On the other side is qualitative research. This is more about generating ideas using things like interviews and observations to understand the why behind the numbers. Let's zoom in on that quantitative side for a second. There are four really common types of design here. You've got exploratory, which is kind of like dipping your toes in the water. Descriptive, which paints a detailed picture of what's going on. Then there's survey research. You've all taken a survey before. And finally, the big one for cause and effect, experimental design. Okay, so this experimental design, it is so powerful. It's pretty much the gold standard for figuring out if A actually causes B. The basic idea is super simple. You change one thing, your independent variable, on purpose, while trying to keep everything else exactly the same, and then you just watch what happens. And here's how it works. You typically have two groups. You have a control group, where you do absolutely nothing, they're your baseline. Then you have the experimental group, and for them, you introduce that one specific change. By comparing what happens to the experimental group versus the control group, you can be pretty darn sure that any difference was caused by the one thing you changed. Okay, so let's say we've picked our blueprint, we've done the work, and we've built our little house of knowledge. But is it a sturdy house? How do we know if the whole structure is sound? In other words, what makes research trustworthy? Well, it all comes back to the quality of that original blueprint. See, a really good, trustworthy research design stands on four key pillars. These are the things that make the final results believable. So what are these four pillars? First, you need neutrality. That means your results are free from bias. You didn't just find what you wanted to find. Second, reliability. This is huge. It means if someone else repeated your study, they'd get pretty much the same results. Third, validity. Are you actually measuring what you think you're measuring? And finally, generalization. Can you apply your findings to a bigger population, or did they only work for the tiny group you studied? You really need all four for the research to be solid. So now that you have the blueprint, you've got the tools. This isn't just about understanding academic studies. This is about being able to think critically about any claim you come across. It really is a blueprint for your own curiosity. So I'll leave you with this. What question will you try to answer?